All right, we're going to take a look at creating virtual machines in VirtualBox. Website for VirtualBox, virtualbox.org. You can download the installer for the software there. I believe it runs on most platforms, so it should work on pretty much any computer you have access to. There's a wealth of YouTube videos that show people setting up VirtualBox, working with it. So if you're having some trouble, you want to find some tutorials, there's a real wealth of information out there. I'd recommend you start with searching YouTube. And the process we're going to follow here is to download an ISO. ISO is a type of file which contains an installable operating system in this case. We're going to set up the virtual machine itself in the VirtualBox software, and then we're going to run the installer, which is part of that ISO, and we'll show you how to make those things connect up together. An alternative to downloading an ISO and running the installer would be to run some imaging software. We use Acronis here at CTP, and there's also things like Clonezilla and many other imaging solutions which will do about the same work. We'll take a look at that in another time. So I have VirtualBox here running in the background. I already have a virtual machine, a Windows machine that I use for some tasks. And to create a new machine, you click the New button. All right, I'm going to give my new machine a name. We're just doing a test, so I call it test. Machine folder is where the file that's going to contain this operating system, this virtual machine, will reside. If you want to change this, you can go ahead and do so. And then you choose what type of operating system you want to install. We have many Windows options here, going all the way back to 3.1 actually, which is sort of amusing. And we have Linux and a number of other operating systems. Some of the more popular Linux distributions are listed here, some of the less popular ones as well. If you can't find what you're looking for, then you can always just choose this other Linux down here at the bottom. Almost everything is 64-bit now, so this is probably the right choice for any distribution that's not already listed there. All right. Next. Here we're going to select how much system memory the virtual machine has access to. It shows you how much is installed in your system. You can't obviously allocate more than that, and you probably don't want to allocate anywhere close to everything that you have. The host still needs some to run. Now you could experiment with what happens if you do over allocate and to see if that'll work out. In my experience, actually it can work okay, but it's not really best practice. 4096 is 4 gigabytes, and that will work with just about any virtual machine we're going to be working with here. It's probably overkill for most lightweight Linux distributions, which is what we're installing now. You could easily take this down to 2 gigabytes for those lightweight Linux distributions, and it should work just fine. Let me decrease my window a little bit here. No, can't scale it. All right. Next, we need to create a virtual storage device where your virtual machine is going to live. And it's going to ask you if you want to create a new one, use an existing one, or some other option. There's a few different formats these virtual disk files can take. This default's probably the right option for you, but you can research the differences between them. There may be a reason you want to use something else depending on your application. Dynamically allocated means that you can set a maximum size to your disk, and if your operating system is using less than that, it's only going to take up that much space in your disk system. If you set to fixed size, there might be some performance advantage there, I'm not exactly sure, but it's going to take up how much ever disk space you allocate to your virtual machine. Dynamically allocated is probably going to be your best bet. And here's where we can set the size itself. You can use the slider or you can just type it in. Since we're dynamically allocating, we can give it a little bit extra than we think it will. It's frustrating when you run out of disk size because you're just kind of stuck. So I always just try to give it a little bit of extra space that I think it will really need. Lightweight Linux distribution probably only takes up a few gigabytes, maybe 10. but 20 is definitely going to be fine. And our virtual machine has been created just like that. It's always good to review the settings before you start using it. Settings icon here. And the items that we want to look at here, I'm actually going to start with storage. This one's important because we have to tell it where to find the installation media. Test.vdi is the virtual disk file where my virtual machine will live on my host storage device. And here is the virtual CD-ROM. This is where I want to insert that ISO file as a virtual optical disk so that it knows how to start the operating system install process. So it says empty. I can click on the disk icon here, and I can choose create virtual disk. All right, so I've already been working with this software, so I have some options here. If you haven't used this before, this will be empty. So you'll need to click add, and then go to the location where you downloaded your ISO file. I created a ISOs folder in my downloads, and so here's the Bodhi Linux that I want to install. If I wanted to install Debian, okay, I have different options for all the different ISOs that I've downloaded. Alright, so now that I've selected Bodhi, it's available in my list. I can choose it, and great. Now I've inserted that ISO as a virtual optical disk into our virtual optical drive. Great. So the next thing you want to do after you've inserted your installed media is to make sure your boot order is correct. Just like in a real physical system, this one will have a boot order. It will look for an installable or a bootable operating system in a certain order. And we want it to boot to the optical disk, so we want to make sure that this is at least in front of the hard drive. I believe you could move it up to the top. You could disable the floppy since it doesn't actually even exist in our system, and that's probably the optimum setup right now. There's some configuration options for a whole bunch of different items here, and usually the defaults will work just fine. VirtualBox, very user-friendly system. It will usually select the right defaults for you, so you can just leave those alone. Alright, great. So we set up our virtual CD-ROM, we verified our boot order, and now we want to take a look at network. If you know a bit about networking, then this system uses NAT. It's kind of like putting your virtual machine behind a router. And NAT will provide it with a network configuration automatically. But the thing is, your virtual machine will be on its own local area network and isolated from your host network. You can connect to the internet because your virtual machine will go through your virtual router to the host and then onto the gateway on your outside local area network. So internet connectivity will work in theory, but we can also select bridged. And when you select bridged, then the IP address of your VirtualBox will come from your host local area network. If there's a DHCP server on that network, then your virtual machine will receive its configuration from that device. It won't be isolated from the other devices on your local area network. NAT's actually pretty nice because it's going to isolate this machine if something goes wrong with this virtual machine, or malicious software or what have you. It's going to be, the rest of your network will be reasonably well protected from it. If you're experimenting with networking, this is nice too because something goes wrong, it's only really going along on this virtual network. Okay, so NAT, choose that unless you know that you need to be choosing bridged. Shared folders, if you want to be able to share files between your virtual machine and your virtual machine host, then you can use shared folders. Not a feature I really am very familiar with or use, but you might find it helpful. Alright, so that's basically what we need to do here. We verified our settings. We inserted our virtual install media. Now we can start the machine. Alright, it's just asking us to verify this installation media. It's good. It's selecting the Bodhi Linux. And we start. Bodhi Linux startup will start here. And we can install the operating system, or we could just test it out. This is going to work just like it were on real physical hardware. And that's what the process of creating a virtual machine looks like in VirtualBox.